I never expected that a quiet afternoon at home could turn my whole world upside down. For 18 years, I believed our marriage was built on trust and understanding. Yet in one ordinary moment, everything changed. I was in the kitchen, rummaging for something among the clutter on the table, when I picked up Rachel's phone. I didn't think much of it at first. I'd done it countless times over the years, a simple act of habit. But as soon as I saw the screen light up with a stream of messages, something felt off. At first, I tried to convince myself that it was nothing more than harmless chatter between colleagues. I started scrolling through the conversation, expecting the usual mundane exchanges about work or daily plans. Instead, I found hundreds of messages, each one laced with flirtatious banter that sent shivers down my spine. The messages weren't just casual. They were intimate and charged, a digital dialogue that spoke of secrets and hidden desires. The turning point came when I noticed the name attached to the messages, Jacob. I recalled him as one of Rachel's colleagues, a name I had heard mentioned of a few times, but never imagined would be so significant. As I read through the text after text, the unmistakable tone of flirtation became impossible to ignore. It was as if I had stumbled upon an entirely different conversation than the one we'd shared for nearly 2 decades. Then there was the photo. Jacob had sent Rachel a candid shot, a picture that was meant to be private, unguarded, and somehow revealing. The way Rachel responded to it was more than just a polite acknowledgement. It was a reaction filled with an unmistakable excitement, a response that betrayed her genuine interest. In that instant, I felt my heart shatter into pieces. The evidence was laid out before me in vivid detail, leaving no room for any doubt. I sat there, frozen, grappling with the surge of emotions that washed over me. There was anger, yes, but also a deep-seated hurt and confusion. How could the woman I had loved and trusted for 18 long years be engaging in something so deceitful? Every message, every flirtatious reply seemed to echo the sound of betrayal. I began to wonder if there had been subtle signs I had missed, whispers of discontent or fleeting moments of distraction. Had our years together been nothing more than a well-rehearsed performance, hiding a truth I was too blind to see? My mind raced as I replayed memories of our past. The laughter, the shared dreams, even the silent moments of understanding that I now realized might have masked a growing distance. Each memory was now tainted by the realization that beneath the surface of our familiar routine, something dangerous and unexpected had been brewing. I couldn't help but question everything. Was our entire marriage just a comforting illusion? Was I naive enough to overlook the signs that were right in front of me? As the shock began to settle into a dull, aching numbness, a new, darker reality emerged. The discovery of these messages wasn't just about infidelity. It was a fundamental breach of trust. It felt as if the very foundation of our 18-year-long union had been compromised, leaving me to wonder how we had arrived at this point. The betrayal wasn't a single misstep or a momentary lapse in judgment. It was an ongoing dialogue of deceit, meticulously woven over weeks, that now demanded an answer. In that heavy silence, as I sat alone with the evidence of her betrayal, I realized that nothing in my life would ever be the same again. I was caught in a moment of stark realization, a crossroads where the path ahead was uncertain and fraught with painful decisions. The messages on that screen weren't just words. They were a declaration that our shared life was crumbling, that the promises of a lifelong partnership had been shattered by secrets and lies. Even as I write this, my thoughts swirl with questions and doubts. What led her to this betrayal? Was it a moment of weakness or something deeper? A call for something she felt was missing in our life? I'm left with a painful mixture of anger, sorrow, and disbelief, wondering how I'm supposed to pick up the pieces of a life that now seems irreparably broken. This revelation has forced me into a confrontation with the harshest truths about love, trust, and identity. The betrayal stings not only because of the act itself, but because it has exposed a chasm in our relationship I never knew existed. Every message, every word exchanged between Rachel and Jacob is now a painful reminder of the trust that was lost. And as I sit here, heart heavy and mind racing, I realize that this is only the beginning of a long and uncertain journey. One where I must decide whether to salvage what remains of a broken promise or to forge a new path from the ruins of our past. Right now, I'm in a state of limbo, grappling with the devastation of betrayal and the fear of an unknown future. I'm trying to make sense of how 18 years of love and companionship could come undone with a few hundred messages on a screen. And while I'm still processing this painful reality, I know one thing for certain. Everything I once believed in is now shrouded in doubt, and the path forward is as daunting as it is inevitable. I remember the distinct sound of the shower door closing behind her, a signal that our private space was about to be invaded by harsh truths. When Rachel emerged from the bathroom, wrapped in a towel and still catching her breath from the steam, I didn't waste a single second. I looked straight into her eyes and demanded, "Who is Jacob?" Her face froze for a split second, a brief flicker of panic, and then she tried to mask it with a tired, dismissive smile. "It's just a friend, Michael," she said, her tone too light, too rehearsed. But I already knew better. Every message, every flirtatious word, every photo on her shattered phone was proof that this wasn't a harmless friendship. It was a betrayal that had been unfolding right before my eyes. I couldn't hold back the torrent of anger building up inside me. The room, which once held memories of love and laughter, now pulsed with an intensity that bordered on the violent. My heart pounded in my ears as I reached out, grabbed the phone from her trembling hands, and without a second thought, hurled it against the wall. The impact was instantaneous. A loud crack, a shower of sparks, and then silence, punctuated only by the sound of my ragged breathing and the slow drip of water from the towel in her hand. I stood there, staring at the wreckage of what used to be her phone, the pieces scattered like tiny shards of our broken trust. In that brief, horrifying moment, I saw a side of Rachel I'd never seen before. Her eyes, wide and shimmering with unshed tears, held a raw, unfiltered fear. It wasn't the kind of fear born from regret or remorse. It was the terror of someone who knows the consequences of their lies have finally caught up with them. Her attempt at denial crumbled under the weight of undeniable evidence. I repeated my question, voice strained and desperate. "Who is Jacob?" But her words, when they came, were barely a whisper, an awkward, feeble protest that did nothing to soothe the fury boiling inside me. She insisted, over and over, that he was nothing more than a friend, a convenient label for a relationship that had clearly crossed every boundary we once set. With each stuttering reply, the room grew heavier with tension, and the distance between us widened into an unbridgeable chasm. I remember feeling a rush of conflicting emotions, anger, sorrow, and a profound sense of loss. Every memory of our 18 years together now felt tainted by her betrayal. How had we let it come to this? Was there ever a chance to salvage what was left of our marriage? Or had this been the inevitable end all along? The shattered phone lay in front of us like a silent witness to the destruction of everything I had once held dear. For a brief moment, as I looked at her, I almost felt a pang of pity. But that feeling was quickly drowned out by a visceral rage, a rage that made me forget who I was. I had discovered her secret, the hidden life of deceit that had been taking shape in the shadows of our everyday routine. And I couldn't help but feel that every lie, every whispered conversation, had been a betrayal of the vows we once made. Rachel's eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape, for any hint that I might relent. But there was no redemption in that moment. Only the bitter reality that nothing could undo the shattered trust. I saw her hands shake uncontrollably, and the fear in her expression was unmistakable. It was the first time I had ever witnessed her so genuinely afraid of me, as if she finally realized that the storm we'd been weathering had reached its violent climax. The room felt suffocating, every second stretching out painfully as I stood there, the weight of betrayal pressing down on both of us. I wanted answers. I demanded an explanation that could justify the countless messages, the secretive exchanges, the hidden rendezvous that had culminated in this catastrophic confrontation. Yet, all I was met with were fragmented words, desperate denials, and the unbearable silence of a trust that had long since been broken. In that charged moment, the shattered phone became more than just a piece of broken technology. It was the physical manifestation of a life dissected into fragments. Each splinter of glass scattered on the floor was a testament to the promises we'd made and the love we'd once shared. I stood there, consumed by anger and hurt, unable to comprehend how something that was meant to be sacred could be so carelessly discarded. Looking into her eyes, I saw not just the fear of imminent consequences, but the dawning realization that our relationship was irrevocably altered. The woman I had known for nearly 2 decades was now a stranger, someone whose secrets had brought us to this breaking point. As I tried to process the swirling maelstrom of emotions, a part of me wondered if there was any hope left for us at all. In that moment, the line between love and hate blurred, and I was left questioning every memory, every shared dream. How could something so deeply rooted in our history unravel so quickly? The intensity of my rage was matched only by the depth of my despair. I couldn't shake the image of her terrified eyes, the sound of shattering glass, and the crushing realization that our marriage was built on a foundation that had been steadily eroded by deceit. I stood there, torn between the urge to lash out further and the gnawing sorrow that perhaps I still loved her despite everything. But the betrayal was too raw, too exposed, and in that heated moment, I knew that the person I once trusted completely was now a stranger. The confrontation had transformed our world into a battleground where every shattered piece of glass was a reminder of the love that had been lost. Even now, as I try to make sense of that day, I'm haunted by the vivid images of that confrontation. The relentless questioning, the desperate denial, and the final, irrevocable act of throwing her phone against the wall. That moment of anger and pain marked a point of no return, a juncture where the past was irretrievably severed from the future. And as the pieces of that phone lay scattered at my feet, so too did the remnants of the trust we once shared, forever lost in the wake of betrayal. The next morning was bitterly cold, a stark contrast to the heated turmoil of the previous day. I woke up feeling the residual sting of our confrontation, every fiber of my being still reeling from the shock and rage. I dragged myself out of bed, mechanically following the routine I'd once taken for granted. But today, everything felt different. Downstairs, I was met with a scene I'd never witnessed in over a decade. Rachel, usually so distant in the mornings, had sat down at the breakfast table with our 2 daughters. Allison, at 14, and Lily, only 9, were there with us. But the air was thick with an unspoken tension that seemed to seep into every corner of the room. For the first time in 10 years, our family shared this one meal together, a meal that, on the surface, appeared ordinary, yet was anything but. Rachel's appearance was hauntingly familiar, yet marred by an unmistakable exhaustion. Her eyes, usually so full of guarded resolve, were now brimming with unshed tears. I could see the weight of the past day's events etched on her face, an expression that mixed remorse, fear, and a kind of profound sadness that I couldn't ignore. The girls, ever so perceptive, exchanged glances that spoke volumes. Allison's normally confident demeanor had faltered, and Lily's wide eyes betrayed her confusion. They both sensed that something was horribly amiss. I had planned to leave for work as usual, trying to bury the gnawing pain of our shattered trust in the mundanity of everyday routine. But before I could gather my thoughts, or my belongings, I noticed a small, yet significant, deviation from normalcy. My phone buzzed incessantly on the counter. With a sinking feeling, I saw that Rachel had already reached out to my boss, informing him that I was sick. The act wasn't entirely surprising. In the wake of last night's explosive confrontation, emotions were running high, and rationality had long since taken a back seat. Yet, it left me feeling both infantilized and manipulated, as though I had been rendered incapable of making my own decisions. Rachel's tone when she called me to talk was soft, but insistent, a quiet desperation that belied the fierce storm that had erupted between us just hours before. I hesitated, feeling the pull of duty and the unresolved anguish that clung to every word she uttered. Despite my better judgment, I knew that avoiding the conversation wouldn't erase the past. Reluctantly, I agreed to sit down and talk, knowing that we were teetering on the edge of an abyss we could no longer ignore. As I joined them at the table, the silence was deafening. The clink of cutlery and the soft hum of the refrigerator seemed to amplify the gravity of the moment. Rachel's eyes, red-rimmed and vulnerable, met mine with an intensity that demanded an explanation, a confession that had to come, whether I was ready for it or not. Allison's worried gaze was fixed on her mother, and even Lily, who rarely understood the subtleties of our emotional landscape, seemed to sense that something was terribly wrong. I couldn't help but feel that our family's breakfast, this rare moment of togetherness, was tainted by the undercurrents of our personal collapse. The table, set meticulously as if to signal normalcy, now bore the heavy weight of a crumbling facade. Every bite of food was punctuated by an internal struggle between the need for answers and the instinct to retreat into the safety of silence. Rachel's insistence on discussing what had happened left me with no choice but to confront the uncomfortable truth that had invaded every corner of our lives. The conversation was slow to begin, each of us carefully navigating the minefield of our shared pain. I could sense that beneath her trembling voice lay a desperate need to explain, to somehow justify the choices that had led us to this precipice. Meanwhile, the children sat quietly, their presence a poignant reminder that our actions carried consequences far beyond the confines of our broken marriage. In that small, cold kitchen, as I reluctantly prepared to engage in a dialogue that I knew would change everything, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that settled over me. It was as if the universe had conspired to force us into this moment of painful reckoning, stripping away the illusions of normalcy we had clung to for so long. The unexpected call to mark me as sick was not just a minor inconvenience. It was a symbolic severing of the roles we had assigned to ourselves within our family, a final act of desperation from a woman who was as much a stranger to me now as the betrayal itself. The morning light filtered weakly through the window, casting long shadows across the table where we sat. Each of us was trapped in our own thoughts, bound together by the shared experience of our unraveling lives. I knew that as soon as I left for work, or tried to, at least, the fragile peace of that moment would be replaced by the relentless march of days that promised to bring more questions, more accusations, and perhaps, in time, more bitter truths. Yet for that brief, excruciating moment, we were all forced to confront the stark reality. Nothing was as it seemed, and our family, our lives, were now defined by an uneasy truce between the past we'd cherished and the uncertain future that lay ahead. I remember the weight of her confession as if it were a physical blow. We were sitting at the kitchen table in the aftermath of that cold, heavy morning, a silence stretching between us as vast as the distance that had grown in our years together. With trembling hands and a voice barely above a whisper, Rachel finally spoke the truth I'd been avoiding since that devastating night. She admitted that her flirtations with Jacob had been her way of filling a void, a desperate attempt to reclaim the attention she so sorely missed. It wasn't that she craved a full-blown affair. Rather, it was the allure of feeling seen and desired. In her eyes, I could read years of loneliness, a deep-seated belief that after our second pregnancy, the world no longer made her feel wanted. She spoke of that time as if it were a distant, yet still painfully vivid, memory, a turning point when her self-worth began to wither in the shadow of our growing complacency. I sat there, stunned into silence. All my life, I'd seen her as this radiant, captivating woman, someone who lit up every room she entered. And yet, as she unraveled her innermost thoughts, I realized with a gut-wrenching clarity that I had rarely, if ever, shown her just how stunning I thought she was. I had been so wrapped up in the monotony of our routine and my own responsibilities that I had let the little affirmations of love and admiration slip away. Her words struck me with the force of a revelation. She wasn't seeking a physical affair, and she swore on everything that she never intended to cross that line. What she craved was affirmation, a reminder that she was not invisible in my eyes. As she talked, I could see the pain etched into every line of her face, the same pain I had unwittingly contributed to over the years. I felt a heavy mix of shock, guilt, and an overwhelming sadness. How had I failed to notice that the warmth in her smile had been slowly dimming? How had I allowed our shared life to become so routine that I forgot to remind her of her worth? Her confession was not a justification for her actions, but a stark indictment of both our failures. Mine in not showing her the love she deserved, and hers in seeking solace outside our marriage. There was a moment when her voice faltered, and the raw emotion behind her words hung in the air like a desperate plea for understanding. I looked into her eyes, now glistening with tears she no longer tried to hide, and saw in them the reflection of all the times I had taken her for granted. I remembered the countless mornings when I'd admired her beauty in silence, convinced that my quiet appreciation was enough. But in that charged silence, the truth became clear. Beauty and desire need to be nurtured with words, actions, and constant affirmation. I had assumed that being together was proof enough of our mutual adoration, without ever really confirming it with her. In that vulnerable confession, Rachel made it clear that the flirtations had been a misguided attempt to feel alive, to remind herself that she was still cherished. She told me that the longing for attention wasn't about seeking someone else's affection. It was a reflection of her inner void, a cry for the reassurance that had been missing since the changes brought on by our second child. And as much as I wanted to protest, I couldn't help but see the truth in her words. I had been so caught up in the everyday grind that I had forgotten the simple acts of appreciation that keep love burning. I struggled to reconcile the image of the woman I had known for 18 years with the person who now laid her soul bare before me. Her confession was a painful reminder that the betrayal wasn't born out of a desire for physical intimacy, but from a deep-seated need for validation, a need I had failed to address. The realization that I had neglected to show her just how beautiful she was, both inside and out, was a bitter pill I wasn't sure I could swallow. In the quiet that followed her admission, I felt both devastated and compelled to make a change. I knew that the road ahead would be fraught with difficult conversations and hard truths. But in that moment, as our shared history and unspoken regrets converged on the kitchen table, I realized that acknowledging my shortcomings was the first step toward any hope of redemption. Her confession wasn't an excuse. It was a mirror reflecting the fractures in our bond, and a call to action that I could no longer ignore. Now, as I sit here reflecting on that fateful conversation, I'm haunted by the echo of her words. I'm left to wonder if I can ever truly repair the damage that has been done. Yet, amidst the wreckage of our past, there's a fragile possibility that with sincere effort and newfound awareness, we might learn to see each other again. The journey to rebuild what we once had starts with understanding the true nature of our failures. And maybe, just maybe, reminding her every single day that in my eyes, she is still as stunning as ever. I spent that long, sleepless night tormented by the questions that now haunted me. The next morning, with a heavy heart and trembling hands, I took the refurbished phone off the shelf, a pricey piece of technology costing over $1,200, which I had always thought symbolized something important in our lives. As I scrolled through its contents, I searched desperately for evidence of something more, records of meetings, plans, or even hints that her flirtations had escalated beyond harmless messages. But the phone revealed nothing concrete. The conversations, as explicit and charged as they were, showed no indication of in-person encounters or secret rendezvous. The absence of clear evidence only deepened the unease within me. If Rachel was willing to engage so openly in flirtatious banter, what else might she have been ready to do? The question gnawed at me, leaving me suspended in a limbo of doubt and suspicion. Unable to shake this restless feeling of impending betrayal, I reached out to Tamara, my ever-reliable sister, who had been my rock through so many storms. I remember dialing her number, my voice barely a whisper as I recounted the details of what I'd discovered. She listened intently, her calm and measured tone a stark contrast to the tumult raging inside me. Tamara didn't rush to judgment. Instead, she gently guided me toward introspection. "Michael," she said, "before you decide what to do next, you need to understand yourself. Figure out what you truly feel, what you need to heal. Only then can you decide whether forgiveness is even possible." Her words, though comforting, struck a chord of harsh truth. I'd been so consumed by my own anger and hurt that I hadn't taken a step back to look at the bigger picture. Was I clinging to a version of our past that no longer existed? Or was there a chance to rebuild on the remnants of trust? Tamara's advice made me realize that I couldn't let my emotions dictate my decisions without first understanding the roots of my pain. I needed to ask myself, was the lack of physical evidence enough to exonerate her actions? Or did the mere willingness to flirt hint at something far more dangerous lurking beneath the surface? As I sat there, reflecting on her words, I replayed every moment from the previous days. I remembered the shock of that cold morning, the terrified look in Rachel's eyes during our confrontation, and her heartfelt confession that her actions were driven by a deep-seated need for attention. I thought about how I had failed to notice her need for reassurance, to remind her that she was as stunning as ever, even after our second pregnancy, when she said she'd stopped feeling wanted. Her words, though painful, were laced with vulnerability, and now I wondered if my own shortcomings had contributed more than I was willing to admit. The refurbished phone lay on the table as silent proof of her digital flirtations, yet it offered no clarity on what might have transpired behind closed doors. Was I overthinking, letting my mind spiral into dark, uncharted territory simply because the messages hinted at a possibility rather than confirming one? Or was I being cautious, knowing full well that sometimes the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence? The doubts swirled in my mind like a persistent storm, each thought more unsettling than the last. Tamara's advice resonated with me long after our conversation ended. She had always been the voice of reason in my life, a steady hand on my shoulder when I felt lost in a sea of emotions. "Take your time," she'd urged. "Understand what you're really feeling. It's not just about what you found on her phone. It's about why it hurts so much and what that pain is telling you about your own needs." Her words forced me to confront the fact that I was in a vulnerable place, grappling with a deep sense of betrayal that wasn't solely about infidelity, but also about the years of neglect and silence that had crept into our marriage. In the quiet aftermath of that realization, I felt as though I were standing at a crossroads, one path leading to irrevocable separation and the other to a long, uncertain journey of reconciliation. The phone, the messages, and the unanswered questions all pointed to a deeper truth. The breakdown of trust in our relationship was not a sudden event, but a gradual decay fueled by unmet emotional needs. I had to ask myself whether I was willing to look inward, to acknowledge the ways in which I might have contributed to this widening chasm between us. Every unanswered question, every nagging doubt, reinforced the need for introspection. I began to wonder if the evidence, or lack thereof, on that costly, refurbished phone was a red herring meant to distract me from addressing the real issues at hand. Perhaps what mattered most was not the digital trail of flirtations, but the underlying emotional neglect that had festered for years. As much as I wanted clear-cut answers, I realized that the truth was far more complex, woven into the fabric of our shared history and the silent wounds we both carried. Now, as I navigate this maze of emotions, I'm left with a lingering uncertainty. I can't shake the thought that if Rachel was willing to engage in such provocative conversations, then there might be layers of intimacy yet unexplored, or risks yet unspoken. The doubt is a constant companion, whispering that maybe this was only the tip of the iceberg. And while I still search for tangible proof that might confirm or dispel my fears, I also know that the journey to forgiveness or finality must begin with me. I have to understand my own heart, the true source of my hurt, and whether the woman I once loved is still capable of earning that trust back. In the echo of Tamara's advice, I find a glimmer of hope. Perhaps by confronting my own vulnerabilities, I can reach a place where I see things more clearly, a place where the absence of physical evidence does not automatically condemn her actions, but instead prompts me to explore the depths of our relationship with a renewed sense of self-awareness. For now, all I can do is wait, reflect, and gradually piece together the shattered fragments of my trust, all the while wondering if the truth behind those flirtatious messages will ever fully reveal itself. The day after everything changed, I woke up to a strange mix of hope and apprehension. Rachel had taken the first step in proving her loyalty. She had changed her phone number. I watched her do it quietly, as if erasing a part of her past that had haunted both of us. It was a small act, yet it carried the weight of a promise that she was ready to leave behind all the flirtatious messages and the allure of fleeting attention. That same day, another surprising shift unfolded at work. Rachel informed me that she had been transferred to another floor of the hospital. The decision came with a significant cost. She would lose her $400 per month salary increase. I couldn't help but marvel at her determination. Here she was, sacrificing not only the convenience and recognition of a more lucrative position, but also the comfort of familiarity, all in the name of proving that she was committed to rebuilding our crumbling trust. In that moment, I saw a side of her that I hadn't seen before, a woman willing to pay a steep price to mend the fractures between us. I realized then that if Rachel was willing to change so radically, I needed to meet her halfway. I began to show more attention to her, trying to fill the void that had grown from years of neglect. I started surprising her with small, thoughtful gestures. I'd leave a handwritten note on her pillow, reminding her how beautiful and essential she was to me. I'd plan impromptu dinner dates, not to force a pretense of normalcy, but to celebrate the moments we still had together. Every time I saw her smile in response, it was like a tiny spark of hope igniting in the darkness of our recent past. As I made these efforts, something unexpected happened. Our intimate life, which had once been a casualty of our growing distance, began to renew itself. One night, as we lay together under the soft glow of our bedside lamp, I noticed a flicker of the old passion in her eyes, a look that said she still longed to feel desired and cherished. In that moment, we both let down our guards. It wasn't just about physical closeness. It was about reconnecting on a deeper level, the kind of closeness that comes from healing old wounds and rebuilding trust, piece by fragile piece. Yet, even as we found solace in each other's arms, a lingering doubt tugged at my mind. A quiet voice whispered that if she could so easily flirt with Jacob, what other boundaries had she been willing to test? I struggled with these thoughts every day. There were moments when the memory of those past messages would flood my mind, threatening to undo the progress we were making. But each time, I reminded myself of the changes she had embraced and the sacrifices she had made. I clung to the hope that our love could evolve from the ruins of betrayal into something more honest and resilient. Then, as if fate had one more twist in store, a message on my phone, one that I wasn't sure should even exist anymore, popped up. It was from an unknown number, a single line that simply read, "I miss you." For a moment, my heart pounded with old fears, and the specter of our troubled past threatened to darken the fragile light of our new beginning. I showed it to Rachel that evening, my voice trembling as I asked, "What is this?" Her reaction was immediate and resolute. With a mix of anger and vulnerability, she explained that the message wasn't from Jacob or any remnant of that past life. It was a mistaken message from an old acquaintance, a relic of a previous time when she had been more carefree, more rebellious. Even though her explanation was plausible, the incident left me with a renewed sense of caution. It was a reminder that trust, once broken, must be rebuilt with time, effort, and unyielding commitment from both sides. Determined not to let the past overshadow the progress we were making, I doubled down on my efforts. I began to express my admiration for her, not just in words, but in everyday actions. I took the time to listen to her stories, to laugh at her jokes, and to remind her that she was the center of my world. I organized weekend getaways, even if just for a day, to places where we could both escape the memories of what had been lost. Slowly, the laughter started coming back, and the quiet intimacy that we had once taken for granted began to reappear. It wasn't long before I noticed that Rachel was responding in kind. Our conversations grew deeper, our shared silences more comfortable. In the gentle light of our renewed connection, she began to confide her fears and hopes more openly. One night, after an especially tender dinner, she reached out to me and said, "I feel wanted again. I feel like I matter." Her words, simple yet profound, echoed in my heart. I realized that while the journey of rebuilding our marriage was still in its fragile infancy, there was a genuine chance for something new, a chance to redefine our love in terms that were honest, transparent, and deeply rooted in mutual respect. As the weeks passed, the changes we had implemented started to weave into the fabric of our daily lives. I was no longer the distant husband lost in his own doubts. I was actively engaged in nurturing the relationship we both so desperately needed. With every unexpected kiss, every spontaneous hug, every whispered, "I love you" in the quiet of the night, I was not just showing my commitment to Rachel. I was rebuilding a foundation that had been shaken to its core. And yet, just as we began to look forward to a future filled with possibility, life reminded us that healing is rarely a linear process. One evening, as I was tidying up after dinner, I found a crumpled note tucked beneath a stack of papers. A note that read, "We need to talk." My pulse quickened with a familiar mix of dread and curiosity. Had another secret from her past resurfaced? Or was it just a leftover piece of a memory she hadn't yet fully processed? When I confronted her about it, she hesitated, then admitted that it was from a friend from her old department, a friend she had lost touch with over the years, who was now reaching out to reconnect. Her voice trembled slightly as she explained that the message was a mistake, a relic of a time when things were simpler, before all the complications had set in. Even as I listened, a part of me held on to the uncertainty. Trust, I reminded myself, is built on continuous effort, and even the smallest crack can sometimes widen if left unaddressed. Despite that small hiccup, our path forward remained clear. Rachel's radical changes, changing her phone number and sacrificing a lucrative position, served as daily reminders that she was committed to our reconciliation. And I, in turn, was determined to never again let complacency or neglect create a chasm between us. With every surprise, every gentle affirmation of love, I strove to remind her that she was cherished and desired, not just as my wife, but as the incredible woman who had the strength to transform our lives with her courage. There were still days when doubts crept in, when the scars of betrayal flared up unbidden, and I wondered if the fresh start was merely an illusion. But then I would catch a glimpse of Rachel, a smile over breakfast, a tender touch as we said goodnight, and I'd feel a warmth that slowly melted the remnants of my old pain. In those moments, the radical changes we had made together shone through, and the promise of a renewed, authentic love felt within reach. Now, as I reflect on these tumultuous weeks, I see that our journey is far from over. The road to rebuilding trust is long and winding, filled with unexpected twists and moments of vulnerability. Yet, in every small act of courage and every bold step toward healing, there is a spark of hope. Rachel's decision to leave behind her past and embrace a future built on loyalty, and my commitment to show her the love she had always deserved, are both acts of faith. A faith that even shattered relationships can, with time and effort, be remade into something stronger and more resilient. As we continue to navigate the uncertainties of our newfound beginning, I hold on to the belief that true love isn't defined by perfection, but by the willingness to change, to forgive, and to grow together. And while the echoes of past betrayals may sometimes threaten to drown out our progress, every tender moment of intimacy, every shared smile, is a testament to the power of a love that refuses to be extinguished. A few months had passed since the storm that nearly tore our lives apart, and I'd begun to accept the slow, painful process of rebuilding what had been broken. Trust was still a fragile thing between Rachel and me, a delicate new sprout amid the ruins of old wounds. Then, out of the blue, I heard something that made my blood run cold and stirred up a tumult of conflicting emotions. I was at the hospital one evening, wrapping up a late shift, when I caught wind of a conversation between colleagues. Whispers floated around about an incident in the parking lot, a violent confrontation that had left someone in intensive care. It turned out that the husband of one of the nurses, whose wife had been involved with Jacob, had taken matters into his own hands. Apparently, he had attacked Jacob in the hospital parking lot with a fury that left the man battered and bruised enough to need intensive care. Hearing that Jacob had survived the brutal assault was a bitter pill. But what struck me most was that after spending 5 long, agonizing weeks in the hospital, Jacob had chosen to leave his job. It seemed that karma, in its own twisted way, had caught up with him. I won't lie. There were moments when I found myself staring into the distance, consumed by a desire for retribution. The betrayal, the raw nerve of every unfaithful message, had once almost pushed me over the edge. I pictured myself tracking him down, letting all the pent-up rage find its target. But I stopped myself. I restrained that urge, even though the temptation for revenge pulsed through me more than once. I spent a lot of time reflecting on that day, on the madness of the assault and the bitter satisfaction that, in some way, it felt like the universe was balancing the scales. But I also knew that giving in to the same destructive impulses would only drag me further down a dark path, one I wasn't willing to walk again. Instead, I chose to channel that raw energy into understanding my own pain and working on a future that wasn't defined by retribution. Rachel and I had been taking tentative steps toward mending our fractured relationship. Every day, we both had to confront the remnants of mistrust and the memory of that heartbreaking betrayal. Yet, even with the scars still fresh, the attack on Jacob served as a grim reminder of what happens when people allow vengeance to take over. While part of me had longed for a similar catharsis, a moment of definitive payback, it was clear that such actions would only perpetuate a cycle of hurt. Instead, I began to see the value in walking a more measured path. In the quiet moments after work, I'd come home to find Rachel in the kitchen, sometimes wiping away tears or lost in thought. I made a point of reaching out to her, of reinforcing that we were in this together. I realized that if I allowed myself to dwell on what had happened to Jacob, I'd risk losing the progress we had made. So, I focused on the little gestures, a warm smile, a spontaneous hug, an evening spent talking rather than brooding. Slowly, the space between us started to shrink, even if it wasn't entirely healed. Our conversations grew more honest over time. We talked about the incident, about how easily lives could be derailed by choices fueled by anger, and about the importance of reclaiming ourselves from the grip of past mistakes. Rachel admitted that, even now, she sometimes struggled with guilt and regret. I, too, had to come to terms with the harsh reality that my own thoughts of revenge were dangerous temptations that could lead us down a path of endless bitterness. In those late-night discussions, as the world outside seemed to quiet down, we made a silent pact. We both understood that, while the wound of betrayal might never fully disappear, we had to nurture the parts of our lives that still held promise. I began to work on showing her that she was cherished, reminding her of the love that had drawn us together for so many years and that still held the potential to save us from our mistakes. In turn, she started to open up more, sharing the small victories of her day-to-day battles and the hopes she harbored for a more stable future. Even as the memory of Jacob's attack loomed like a cautionary tale, it also served as an unexpected turning point for me. It was a stark illustration that life was unpredictable and that anger, when left unchecked, could lead to irreversible consequences. I realized that the path I wanted for myself, and for us, was one of deliberate, thoughtful healing rather than blind retribution. I refused to let the actions of others dictate the course of my own recovery. There were moments, particularly in the quiet of early morning or late at night, when the urge to lash out flared up unexpectedly. I'd find myself drifting into thoughts of how satisfying it might be to see Jacob suffer a taste of his own medicine. But then I'd remember Tamara's advice, the reflection of my own better nature, and the precious, delicate bond that was slowly being restored with Rachel. In those moments, I chose to take a deep breath, to step away from the precipice of that dark emotion, and to focus on the real work of rebuilding trust and healing our marriage. Now, as I write this, I'm aware that the road ahead remains uncertain. Trust isn't fully restored. Not yet, but every day, with every sincere conversation and every small act of love, we are slowly finding our way back to each other. The memory of that violent incident with Jacob serves as both a grim reminder of how far we could fall and a beacon guiding us away from the destructive lure of revenge. In the end, I've come to understand that the journey of healing is not about erasing the past, but about learning from it. Jacob's misfortune, brutal as it was, underscored the fact that no one escapes the consequences of their actions unscathed. Yet, in contrast to the man who unleashed violence out of rage, I chose a different path, one where forgiveness, introspection, and a commitment to rebuilding what truly matters take precedence over the fleeting satisfaction of revenge. Rachel and I are still working on our marriage, and every day is a battle fought with honest conversation, renewed commitment, and the understanding that we do not want to lose each other. Our love may be scarred, but it is far from broken. And as we continue on this challenging journey, I hold on to the belief that, together, we can create a future where the echoes of past betrayals are gradually replaced by the steady, hopeful rhythms of trust and mutual respect.